backing up on your comment, it'd be fascinating if the trade agreement dies because of cows in Quebec.
Yeah, it would be. It would be a sad story, but that could be what happened. Welcome back to Behind the Headlines, Canada's fastest growing political podcast. This week, Washington told Canada we could be paying for a new trade deal with permanent tariffs. But while the media panics, they're missing the off-ramp, hit it right in front of them. We're going to expose that and the consequences of not negotiating in good faith. And later, you'll hear the masterclass speech from Pierre Poilievre that has Liberals completely scrambling. We're fighting our own battle against the YouTube algorithm. Smash that like button, hit subscribe, and leave a comment to help us reach more Canadians. Before we get into the show, the number one news story this week is the ongoing conflict in Iran. We'll talk about it more next week, but Ian, what's your initial reactions to it?
Well, I think that Trump did the right thing, and Carney has said as much. And, the only problem I have is that I don't think it's going to be like Venezuela. It's not going to be in and out quickly. It's going to be a prolonged war.
We'll see. We'll see how long it goes on. My opinion is very simple, and I said this to you just before we got on the air. I was very happy with the statement that Mark Carney put out. I pat him on the back for calling the Iranian regime what they are. Iran is the number one state sponsor of in this entire world. They are responsible for the of countless people, including Canadians and, even people on that plane that was down a number of years ago. But we're going to get to that next week because this is certainly going to develop over the next little while. All right, let's start with the Trump administration's warnings. Jamieson Greer is the man that the New York Times calls the quiet architect of Trump's global trade. In a recent interview, Greer said that if Canada wants any deal with the United States, that we're going to have to accept a base level of permanent tariffs as a price of admission to the American market. If you want to know how blunt the Trump administration is being with Ottawa.
Does the president feel constrained by USMCA?
So I wouldn't say feel constrained. We're in the middle of a review that we have to conduct in the United States. I'm in contact with my counterparts from both Mexico and Canada. There are things in USMCA that make sense that don't get a lot of news because they function fine. But there are a lot of things where we don't have the type of market access we want, whether it's in goods or services. We have Mexico that historically, over the past few years, has been discriminating against U.S. energy producers and service providers. We have Canada that limits our access for dairy, has taken American wine and spirits off its shelves. So we have a lot of issues like that. We also have concerns about transshipment through Canada and Mexico of goods from third countries coming through and benefiting from duty-free treatment.
Okay, Ian, so what's your reaction to that?
Well, what has happened is the Trump administration has finally revealed their new strategy going forward with the review of Canada-U.S.-Mexico trade agreement. After months of saying that CUSMA was dead, Washington is now saying the agreement will likely survive as a one-year renewable trade pact. This is a huge problem for Canada. A one-year renewal will stop any foreign investment from coming into Canada. And beyond that, they've identified the areas where they want to have sub-agreements with Canada and the U.S. or Canada and Mexico for particular trade irritants. Now, the one thing that Greer said there that I'll come back to later is transshipment of products through Canada. And he's particularly thinking of the new agreement we signed with China to allow electric cars into Canada.
It all comes back to China, and we're going to talk a lot about China today. But I'm going to say a lot of things about Donald Trump during this episode that's going to anger half of you, and it's going to make the other half of you happy. But I'm just telling you how I see it based on what I've seen. But something hit me last night. These so-called demands aren't a list. I think that they're an off-ramp. If you look at President Trump's pattern, he, forcing China to the table, staring down Maduro, recently the Ayatollah, it's always the same. The administration lays out brutal conditions up front. They spell out the consequences, and then they act decisively. And unfortunately, Canada now faces a brutal choice. We either have to open up the dairy market or we have to sacrifice our auto industry. And Mark Carney has recently took dairy off the table, which makes sense because we know who controls the Liberal Party. But the point is that, we can't control Donald Trump, but we can hold Carney's government accountable. Dominic LeBlanc just blamed the bureaucracy for their own failures. Well, Mr. LeBlanc, you're the one in power, so dismantle the bureaucracy. Don't blame somebody else, and let's get this country going. Ian, do you have anything else to add to that?
Backing up on your comment, it'd be fascinating if the trade agreement dies because of cows in Quebec.
Yeah, it would be. It would be a sad story, but that could be what happened. And many of you have tuned in to hear the story behind Pierre Poilievre's speech this week, but this clip right after it is just as important. Pierre says that Canada needs to stop screaming and start negotiating with the United States. Listen to this.
Is that you're very calm. You have a very calm tone when it comes to talking about the United States. But Canadians are pretty angry about what's happening. So why aren't you angrier about this?
Well, because what would that do? Would that get the auto worker in Windsor working again? Would it allow people to put food on their table in Hamilton or the Sioux? We have to focus on what we can do and what we can control. That's all we can do. We can't control what the president has, and this is, by the way, something that Mark Carney has said, and I agree with him. He has said that we cannot control what the U.S. president says or does.
Okay, and so there's the opposition leader. What do you think of his comments?
He quotes Carney, and Carney can't control Doug Ford. Doug is constantly having hissy fits and picking fights with the U.S. as Carney's rat pack partner. He's done nothing but cause trouble between Canada and the United States for months now. And that's with Carney's blessing. We have to be respectful and negotiate a new deal in good faith, despite what Mr. Carney, who hasn't even been living in Canada for years, has been saying. The United States is not Canada's enemy. We've been friends and partners for over 150 years.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think that this is the logical, rational approach that we should have been taking with the United States all along. Our job is to put Canada's interests first, and the Americans have to put their interests first. It's okay to agree with Donald Trump when he does something right and disagree with him when he does or says something wrong. And that's the approach that I take. Do I want the tariffs? Of course not. But if Trump brings an end to an Ayatollah who's responsible for Canadians, then yes, I'm gonna stand with our ally on that. And as I've said on the show many times, what's at risk here could devastate the Canadian economy. And that's why when I comment on the president, I'm just observing what I see based on the facts in front of me. I just wish that the media would do the same. Do you have anything else to add to that, Ian?
No, that says it all.
Okay, perfect. Okay, well, now move on to a next segment. While the political class is spiraling over every headline out of Washington, we just seen Pierre Poilievre just did something the Prime Minister seems incapable of. He chose logic over emotion. Most are reacting to the U.S. with either blind outrage or sheer desperation. But Poilievre, he's proposing a real-world auto pact, trading a hard line on Chinese vehicles for guaranteed tariff-free access to the American market. It's a pragmatic job-first strategy that has the Liberals completely rattled. And here is exactly why Ottawa is panicking.
Speech today, Poilievre outlining his plans to build Canada's economy and how he would help the Canadian auto sector.
The Conservatives will fight for a tariff-free auto pact with the United States, with shared protections against Chinese imports. In short, here's the deal. We should agree to keep Chinese vehicles out if Americans agree to let Canadian vehicles in. A full exemption to Buy America rules so that our companies can compete on construction projects, and a relaunch of the Keystone XL pipeline.
I'm joined by Brian Kingston, President and CEO of the Canadian Vehicle Manufacturers Association. Brian, good evening and thanks for your time.
Thanks for having me on.
So Pierre Poilievre proposed a new auto pact in his address today. What are your thoughts about this proposal?
Well, I think it's bang on. It's exactly the type of proposal that we need to be making to the Americans. The auto industry is under extreme pressure right now because of Section 232 tariffs and because of the uncertainty around the future of our trade agreement. We've been making the case that if we want to strike a deal with the Americans, keeping China out has to be priority number one.
So what's your reaction to that?
I like Pierre's idea of an auto pact, and I want to point at a previous Prime Minister of Canada, Mike Pearson. In the 1960s, Mike, and there's his picture on the wall, negotiated an auto pact with the United States, which has been, shall we say, torn apart bit by bit over the last number of years. It's a very sensible idea. Get it outside of CUSMA and just make a deal to help both the United States and the Canadian auto companies. Because as we know, sometimes those vehicles move back and forth across the border 8 times while they're being prepared for the market. And it only makes sense that they should have a special auto pact, a special agreement that protects the future of North American autos.
Yeah, I agree with you, and I think that, as I've said before, these negotiations are simple. You put you say to the Americans, you guys are going to put America first, and Canada's going to put America first. We fix the imbalances, but here are the things that we disagree on. That's how adults deal with Trump, and I think that this auto pact fits that strategy. It pushes Chinese tech and influence back out of his hemisphere, which has been a strategic goal of the Americans in this administration, while also protecting Canadian auto jobs. And, China has been smart about this. They've completely steamrolled, Western powers. But, the U.S. is trying to lock them out, and the American public supports that. 42% see China as the greatest threat to the U.S. And I think that Canada and the U.S. needs to stop China from becoming that dominant force. Why do you think Trump is obsessed with fentanyl precursors coming from China into Canada? Carney isn't doing that. He's running the elbows up outrage brigade, feeding emotion instead of delivering results. Now, the results that he has delivered, though, are pretty bad. A Political Report poll says that 48% of Canadians now see the U.S. as a bigger threat of Russia. Do you have anything else to add to that, Ian?
The United States is not a threat to Canada. It never has been. When I look at the 2 sources of exports from Canada to the States, 2 biggest ones are Alberta oil and Ontario automobiles. Now, Alberta already gets special treatment from the U.S. with just a 10% tariff. That hasn't slowed down our exports of oil whatsoever. Canada's auto sector needs the same special treatment.
Yeah. I completely agree. This next clip shows the early response to his speech, including voices that you don't normally hear echoing conservative policy. Here's that clip.
I mean, I agree with James. I think it was a really good speech. In fact, Carney could have made a speech like that. I think his comments on China were wrong. I think that I think it's not about rejecting the United States and accepting China again. It's about making sure that we are broadening our trading relationships with countries around the world, including the 2 biggest economies in the world. So there's a few points of disagreement I'd find in that, but I thought he did a good job of kind of resetting himself as a statesman. And he has, he's a big imagination about what he'd like to imagine to do at the table if he got the chance. Fact is, he doesn't have the chance at the moment. He's not at the table, and he probably doesn't have a lot of information about what's happening there. Nonetheless, though.
Okay, Ian, so what's your response to Christy Clark there, former Liberal Premier of British Columbia?
It was high praise for Pierre's reasonable approach to Canada-U.S. relations. And Tom McClure, the former leader of the NDP, has said similar things. Not like the Carney Liberals, MPs and talking heads accusing Conservatives of being traitors and too ugly for politics. That's just disgusting. Politics should not be dragged into the sewer by Liberals. Ideas from all party leaders should be respected and listened to. That was a case not too long ago in Canada's Parliament with leaders like Pierre Trudeau and Brian Mulroney and others.
Yeah, I think I agree with everything that you just said. It is funny, though, because when Christy Clark considered running for the Liberal leadership, I called her out because she's not really a Liberal. Maybe she's a conservative. I don't really know here. I think in reality, I think she's a squish who just wags her finger in the air and goes with the wind. You know what? I'll take it. And Ian, as you always say, these clips are great because they reinforce what we're saying, because it's even better when someone else points it out first. All right, everyone, that's all we have for this week. As mentioned, next week, if there is something that we need to address when it comes to the Iran conflict, we will. Mark Carney is abroad, so we'll have to figure out what kind of results he gets. But anyways, everybody, please remember to like, comment, and subscribe. We really are in a battle to beat this algorithm. And I know you only seem like one person, but one person can go a big difference. So please do that for us. It really appreciated it. Help us reach more Canadians. Without further ado, we'll see y'all next week.